Uh, Welcome all. Today we are going to discuss about antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. These both are posterior pituitary hormones, and these hormones mainly responsible for antidiuretic hormone. Otherwise, we call it as vasopressin, and oxytocin. Both are posterior pituitary hormones. Antidiuretic hormones are mainly responsible for reabsorption of water and mainly reabsorption of water and many other functions. And coming to the oxytocin, oxytocin is mainly responsible for milk ejection reflex. It also helps in uh, parturition and many more actions. Let us discuss these two posterior pituitary hormones. Point by point, we'll discuss. So before that, we must understand that the posterior pituitary hormones, they release from mainly they are synthesized. They are synthesized within the within the hypothalamus. Within the hypothalamus, the connection between the posterior pituitary and the hypothalamus is by a neural stalk. From the hypothalamus, the posterior pituitary is communicated by a neural stalk, neurosecretory cells, as we can see in this diagram. Then from the neural stalk, these neurosecretory cells releases the cell bodies of these neurosecretory cells are present in the hypothalamus, and the nerve endings which is communicating to the posterior pituitary, that we call it as neurohypophysis, pars nervosa of neurohypophysis, right? So the parts, if you see the parts, the infundibulum or stem, the median eminence, and pars posterior, pars posterior, median eminence, and infundibular stem. So, as together, we can say the communication between the hypothalamus and posterior pituitary. We also we can say that this is hypo, hypophyseal neurosecretory connection, or we can say hypothalamo-hypophyseal neurosecretory cells, whereas the anterior pituitary is connected by hypothalamo-hypophyseal uh, portal system, that is for anterior pituitary, and for the uh, posterior pituitary, it is by disconnected neuronally. Then the posterior pituitary hormones, as I told you, that there are two important hormones released from the posterior pituitary, that is antidiuretic hormone. Otherwise, we call it as vasopressin, and the other hormone is oxytocin. The structure, synthesis, storage, and release of antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin being similar are discussed together. The structure, antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin both are homologous neurohormones, polypeptide in nature, containing 9 amino acids. Here we must understand the anterior pituitary hormones. They are releasing directly from the blood vessels. They are releasing from the blood vessels into the bloodstream. But here, the posterior pituitary, they are releasing from the nerve endings. nerve endings. In the synthesis, the antidiuretic hormone or vasopressin as well as the oxytocin that are synthesized in the cell bodies of magnocellular neurons, both paraventricular and supraoptic nuclei of hypothalamus. So they are synthesized in. There are many nuclei within the hypothalamus. So among that, the paraventricular and supraoptic nuclei synthesizes the ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. However, the supraoptic nucleus predominantly contains ADH forming neurons, while paraventricular nucleus contains mainly the oxytocin synthesizing neurons. The axons of ADH and oxytocin synthesizing neurons end in the posterior pituitary gland as terminal swellings. The secretory granules containing hormones precursors known as Herring bodies are transported down to the axon by exoplasmic flow in the nerve endings in the posterior pituitary. That means what? These hormones that are synthesized within the nucleus. Nucleus is nothing but what? Nucleus means group of cell bodies within the central nervous system. So group of cell bodies, if they are present within the central nervous system, that we call it as nucleus. So these hormones, ADH and oxytocin, they synthesized within the cell bodies of the paraventricular nucleus and supraoptic nucleus of hypothalamus. But coming to the storage, the axons of the ADH and OTC synthesizing neurons end in the posterior pituitary gland. I told you the communication between the hypothalamus and posterior pituitary neuronal connection. So these secretory granules contains hormone precursors known as Herring bodies transported down the axons by exoplasmic flow to nerve endings in the posterior pituitary. What about secretion? Antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin are released when a nerve impulse is transmitted. When a nerve impulse is transmitted from the cell body in the hypothalamus down the axon, where it depolarizes the neurosecretory vesicles. So for secretion, it requires a threshold stimulus. So a threshold stimulus is required for the release of oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. So what are the main stimulus for antidiuretic hormone? As I told you, the antidiuretic hormone is mainly helps in water retention, and oxytocin is mainly helps in milk ejection reflex and parturition. So for this stimulus, if your body is dehydrated, say for example, when you are not hydrated your body well, so in those cases, your antidiuretic hormones will get signals. This will get signals, and immediately you will hydrate your body. So whenever you lose water from your body, then antidiuretic hormone releases and it helps in water retention. And for oxytocin, especially, we see this oxytocin in milk ejection reflex whenever the baby suckles the nipple. So there is the reflex activity causes release of more and more amount of oxytocin for the release of milk from the mammary glands. And oxytocin also helps in parturition. So oxytocin, we can say oxytocin. So this is the best example. This hormone is the best example for a positive feedback mechanism. So whenever the stimulus, uh, so once it's stimulus, uh, once it stimulated the nucleus, it causes a release of more and more amount of hormones. So continuous stimulus causes continuous release of these hormones, which helps in milk ejection reflex as well as parturition. So antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin are released when a nerve impulse is transmitted from the cell body in the hypothalamus down the axon when it depolarizes the neurosecretory vesicles. So here depolarization means where from the vesicles the action potential reaches the axon terminals and it causes open when the action potential reaches the nerve terminal, it causes opening of calcium gated channels. So the released calcium ions, it binds with the vesicle, it brings the vesicle down to the nerve terminal, and it causes release of the hormones and vasopressin and oxytocin in the manner of uh, in the process of exocytosis, that release of these hormones, the both hormones. Transport. The hormone and other secreted products separately enter the closely adjacent capillary. The hormone then reaches the target cell and by circulatory interconnection to the anterior pituitary also. See here from the posterior pituitary in the diagram it was shown that from the hypothalamus, when the hypothalamus is stimulated with the threshold stimulus, when it is stimulated, the hypothalamus is stimulated. It causes the release of these hormones, especially when we talk about antidiuretic hormone, it released from the posterior pituitary. So the release of hormones is more when the body is dehydrated. So when the body is dehydrated, in the upper case, we can see in the diagram, it will show that when the body is dehydrated, there is increased ADH secretion, and increased ADH secretion causes more water absorption. The water is absorbed from the renal tubules that leads to concentrated urine. So the excretion of urine, so the person can pass a concentrated urine. Uh, Whereas when there is less water is, that means when the body is fully hydrated, when you drank so much of water, then less ADH will be released. So less water is absorbed. So the diluted urine will be excreted by the person. So in this diagram, we can see the renal tubules. It is when the ADH is secreted more, it binds with the collecting tubules, collecting ducts, and the distal tubules and collecting ducts. The ADH binds with the receptors, then it causes intake of water into the bloodstream, and the person will pass concentrated urine. Why it is concentrated? Because water is reabsorbed back when the ADH secretion is more, whereas in hydrated person, the less amount of ADH is secreted and less water is absorbed, then the person will dilute. The person excrete diluted urine. Next, if you see very close in the uh, in the renal tubules, what happens in the collecting ducts in this diagram, you can see very clearly in the renal tubules, what happens, the person is less hydrated, means person is when the water levels in the body are reduced. Say, for example, when the person uh, uh, lost in the desert for plenty of hours, how actually our kidney works, and rescue from that situation for few hours. What happens when the person lost in the desert? What happens for few hours? Kidney will maintain the water balance by releasing antidiuretic hormone. So antidiuretic hormone, it prevents the loss of water. So when your body water levels are reduced, immediately these antidiuretic hormones will be released from the posterior pituitary, and it uh, binds with the receptors, IDH receptors, which are present in the collecting ducts. So when these IDH binds with these receptors, which are mainly present in the collecting ducts, it binds with the receptor and it causes opening of the water channels. Otherwise, we call it as aquaporin. So these aquaporins are inactive until the binding of these ADH hormone with the receptor. So whenever there is a formation of ADH and receptor, hormone receptor complex formation, these aquaporins, these aquaporins form a channels, water channels. So there are many types of water channels, aquaporins 1, 2, 3, 4, like that. So there are many water channels, aquaporins present in the collecting duct. So these forms water channels. Otherwise, we can say simply, so when the DH binds with these receptors, water channels will be formed, and water will be absorbed back into the blood vessels. So this we call it as water retention. Water retention by the action of antidiuretic hormone. So here we must understand diuresis means loss of water. Antidiuretic means water loss is prevented. So which hormone is prevented? That is antidiuretic hormone. Otherwise we call it as vasopressin. Right. Now if you see the actions of ADH, so the main action on the kidney is it regulates the water balance in the body by acting on the kidney, where it decreases the excretion of free water, that is antidiuretic, and concentrating effect on kidney. So this is one of the main reason we can say to the question, that is why the urine is concentrated. So how kidney is maintaining hyperosmolarity. So one of the reason is the binding of ADH to the uh, collecting ducts and opening of the channels, water channels. Otherwise, we call it as aquaporin, as we discussed in the previous slide we discussed. Another function is vasoconstrictor effect. Antidiuretic hormone in large doses cause vasoconstriction and leads to rise in blood pressure. So, antidiuretic hormone, another important function is it contributes in vasoconstriction and leads to rise in blood pressure. We all know few hormones are responsible for vasodilation, especially the local hormones like prostaglandins, CO2 levels. CO2 is not a hormone, but the local factors for vasodilations, which reduce the blood pressure. But when there is a severe blood loss, like in hemorrhagic conditions, so hemorrhage is also one of the potent stimulator for the hypothalamus. So during hemorrhage, that is a loss of blood, we can see during accidents, there is a severe blood loss. Uh, so in those cases, antidiuretic hormone in large doses, it will release and it causes vasoconstriction to maintain the blood pressure, right? So this is another important function of antidiuretic hormones. So this antidiuretic hormone is a posterior pituitary hormone, but it also contributes in releasing of some anti-pituitary hormones. So antidiuretic hormone travels to the anterior pituitary via the portal veins and combines with the B1B receptors, also called B3 receptors, and causes increased ACTH secretion from the corticotropes. Right. So another important function on the liver. In the liver, ADH causes glycogenolysis by combining with the V1A receptors. So when we need more energy in critical conditions, so ADH causes glycogenolysis and it causes a release of glucose into the bloodstream, especially when the sympathetic nerve fibers are stimulated, when the sympathetic tone is more. We can say in the example of fight or flight reactions, when the adrenal secretion will be more, the body requires more glucose. So in those conditions, ADH causes glycogenolysis by combining with the V1A receptors and causes release of uh, glucose into the bloodstream. Then action on the brain. So the same V1A receptors are also found in brain where ADH acts as a neurotransmitter and is involved in memory, regulation of temperature, regulation of blood pressure, circadian rhythms, and brain development. So when it combines with the V1A receptors in the brain, so it involves in memory. Memory is in mainly in the parietal cortex. Uh, Parietal cortex also responsible for short-term memory, and cerebral cortex is mainly responsible for memory and regulation of temperatures by vasoconstriction effect, regulation of blood pressure, circadian rhythms. That means your biological cycle and development in brain. Then coming to the regulation of ADH secretion, uh, so mainly the regulation of ADH secretion, there is a change in plasma osmolarity. This is a very potent regulator of ADH secretion, and changes in the circulating blood volume, central blood volume, cardiac output, and blood pressure affect the secretion of ADH. And antidiuretic hormone secretion is increased when extracellular fluid is low and decreased when extracellular volume is high. And during the conditions of stress, of pain, chronic emotional stress, and surgical procedures causes increase in ADH secretion, uh, leading to reduction in urine formation under these conditions. So, especially we can notice when you are in deep stressful conditions, the ADH secretions will be increased. So that is why when you observe in stressful conditions and in emotional stress, we won't feel uh, filling of bladder. So that is due to ADH secretion. It causes retention of the water from the renal tubules, so the filling will be less in the urinary bladder. Next, uh, the release of adrenaline causes the decreases the ADH, hence one experiences an increase in frequency of micturition during acute emotional stresses such as interviews or examinations. In acute cases only. Alcohol reduces ADH secretion and thus leads to diuresis. And age, elderly individuals secrete more ADH than do younger individuals. Abnormalities of ADH secretion so, abnormalities of ADH secretion include syndrome of inappropriate hypersecretion of ADH and diabetes insipidus. So, syndrome of inappropriate hypersecretion of antidiuretic hormone refers to a condition in which ADH secretion is increased despite the presence of hyposmolarity. Excessive ADH secretion leads to water intoxication. If what happens when the ADH secretion is more, that leads to more water retention. So that causes water intoxication. That is overhydration, and because of this condition, otherwise we call it as dilution syndrome. Dilution syndrome. The causes of this excessive secretion of ADH from the posterior pituitary may occur during surgical stress because of pain and hypovolemia, and also in cerebral diseases, in pulmonary diseases such as bronchogenic carcinoma, and excess of ADH due to its decreased metabolic degradation may occur in patients with liver cirrhosis and cardiac failure. Next, coming to another condition, that is diabetes insipidus. Diabetes insipidus refers to a clinical condition of polyuria that occurs either due to deficiency or what happens. So, what happens if sufficient amount of ADH is not released, even though when there is a sufficient threshold is reaching to the uh, nucleus of the hypothalamus. So, due to deficiency of ADH, that means the release or failure of renal response to ADH. If sufficient amount of ADH is not released, or if sufficient amount of ADH released, but it is not able to bind with the receptors, these are the causes for diabetes insipidus. So the main characteristic features of these are polyuria, that means passing large amount of urine, that is 3 to 20 liters of low specific gravity, is the most important single feature of diabetes insipidus. Polydipsia is followed by obligatory polydipsia, drinking of large amount of water. It occurs due to stimulation of thirst mechanism. In fact, polydipsia is a very important mechanism which helps to maintain water balance. So polydipsia is, we can say, this is one of the homeostatic mechanism. Homeostasis means maintenance of internal environment of the body. Otherwise, we call it as maleo interior, within the physiological limits, right? So polydipsia is an important mechanism which helps to maintain water balance with near normal plasma sodium level in patients with the diabetes insipidus. Next, dehydration may occur in severe cases. Its signs and symptoms include dry tongue, dry mouth, fall of blood pressure, and loss of consciousness may be seen in acute severe cases. So this is all about antidiuretic hormone. Next we'll discuss about oxytocin. So the main actions of the hormone oxytocin is on uterus and breast. So how oxytocin acts? So oxytocin binds with these G-coupled protein receptors or serpentine receptors, or otherwise we call it as 7 transmembrane proteins, and increases intracellular calcium levels. So we all know that what happens when the calcium levels are more intracellular. Usually this calcium is stored in sarcoplasmic reticulum, and depending upon the need, calcium levels, and depending upon the stimulus, calcium levels will be increased intracellularly. Action on the breast. Oxytocin causes contraction of myoepithelial cells, thus plays an important role in milk ejection. Action on the uterus. Oxytocin causes contraction of the uterine smooth muscles. This plays an important role during parturition. So you can see this uh, diagram that when the brain is getting stimulus to the posterior pituitary gland, it secretes oxytocin into the bloodstream, and it supplies to the stimulation of the udder by washing, milking, or suckling. So the mammary gland is stimulated. So whenever the mammary gland is stimulated, these um, sensation reaches to the sensation reaches through the spinal cord, and again the stimulus reaches to the hypothalamus. So in this way, so this reflex actions will be continued until the stimulus is reaches. Next, it also plays an important role in the mechanism of parturition that causes contraction of the uterus by contracting. So the starting mechanism is by a contraction of the fundus and spreads to the lower segment. The intensity of contraction is strong at the fundus but weak at the lower segment. In early stages, uh, so for every 30 minutes we see one contraction. As the labor progress, so we see one contraction for every 1 to 3 minutes. So abdominal wall muscle contracts and there is a rhythmical contraction allows blood flow. In males, circulating levels of oxytocin increase during ejaculation, which causes increased contraction of smooth muscles of vas deferens and helps in propelling the sperms towards urethra. And not control of oxytocin secretion, the stimuli which increases oxytocin secretion are, as I told you, oxytocin secretion increases on cholinergic stimulation, in suckling reflex, and in genital tract stimulation during coitus, and labor increases oxytocin release. The factors which decreases oxytocin release are mainly emotional stress, sympathetic stimulation, and drugs such as ethanol and enkephalins. So these enkephalins are endorphins and enkephalins are mainly we say these are happy hormones. So, so these are the factors which are responsible for the decreased oxytocin release. So the main role of oxytocin is in acts on breast and uterus, which helps in parturition and also in milk ejection reflex. So that's all about posterior pituitary regarding vasopressin, antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. So thank you very much.